No one heard her cry, except the prairie. She had learned how to keep the world at a distance the way a house keeps out wind. Close the shutters, tuck the blanket tight. Let the small things that must be done stand between you and the rest. Her days were measured in chores and the slow habits of survival. At dawn, she checked the cistern, set a pot of water on the stove, swept the thin dust from the floorboards the way one sweeps away small griefs, hoping the motion might settle what could not be spoken back into stillness. A photograph, its edges softened by years of being touched and set down, lived on a narrow shelf above the iron stove. A man whose laugh came to her in glimpses behind the work of the day. She kept that laugh like a saved ember. The house sat where the desert thinned and the low hills began to roll. An old clapboard with a porch that creaked under the weight of seasons. The land around it was honest and plain. Tall grass that bowed to the wind. A dry wash that marked the line between the flat and the rise. A few scattered mesquite and the plain horizon that always seemed to hold a small, patient light. People in the town, when they had occasion to come by, called her the Apache widow without a question and with little thought. The name fit the shorthand of a place where everyone stored their stories in single words. She did not correct them. Names are small things. They are given and taken by the world. She kept to herself more as a choice than as a demand. A way to keep what remained of life steady. On the day she found him, the heat had been heavy since morning. A pressing thing that made breath slow and the world seem softer edged. The sky was big and clear, and the wind moved like an invisible hand over the prairie, brushing seed heads and lifting dust in pale ribbons. She was walking toward the wash with a bucket for water and a cloth to dry the interior of her larder when she saw the shadow first. A dark line against dry sand, a bundle that did not belong to the land's quiet pattern. At first she thought it might be a wind-tossed blanket or a pack that had been abandoned. Then the sound reached her, a ragged, half-breathed curse, more animal than human, and something in it took the measure of danger. She crossed the wash with slow, deliberate steps. The closer she came, the more the man resolved into a man, and a man who was very much alive and very much near the edge of not being so. He lay on his back, one boot twisted at an odd angle, a wide smear of dark on his shirt where the dust had taken to blood. He blinked when she set her bucket down, and his mouth shaped grateful sounds that were half apology. When she crouched, the wind folded around her like a hand, and the prairie drew tight as if it were listening. "You hurt," she said. Her voice was a dry rope, used to carrying small, necessary things. He nodded. His eyes were the color of smoke, and quick with a kind of embarrassed fear. He had the look of a person who had tried to keep the truth inside until it could no longer be held. She did not ask questions that required proof or complex answers. There was no need. She hauled his shoulder with a steadiness born of long work. She hooked her arm behind his back and, with a grunt, set him upright. He was heavy with pain, but heavier still with a stubbornness that resisted help. He tried to rise to his feet on his own, listened to the protest of muscles and the land's silent counsel, and then allowed himself to be led. The house accepted him the way the prairie accepted the wind, without surprise. She laid a blanket on the bed, poured water over a rag, and held it to his face. She rinsed dust from his hair, and found the rag sticky at the jaw where dirt had dried like grit. She cleaned the wound with slow hands, removing stones and cloth, and the tiny, painful things that had no business in a man's skin. When she wrapped his ankle, she used coarse linen, and the kind of knot that stays. The first night she sat by the stove and mended shirts while he slept in a fitful way. Small sounds breaking like distant birds. He woke with the light, coughing. The way a man wakes from a dream that left him nervous and raw. He was quick to apology, quicker to self-reproach, and he kept his questions small as if larger ones might be contagious. The first time he tried to ask why she had done what she did, why she had dragged him from a lonely stem of the wash, he only managed a line about being no good, about deserving nothing. She did not choose to argue that morning. She offered him food instead. Roasted beans thick with fat. Water from the cistern that tasted faintly of iron and spring. He ate with a hunger that was both astonishment and gratitude. Hands that trembled as they reached. Weeks, when they came. Moved with the deliberate quiet of seasons. Her care was practical and ruled by the daily needs of an animal and by the language of hands. She taught him, or perhaps reminded him, how to take his tea so it did not scald the throat. How to rest the foot so the swelling could find a way back to normal. where on the porch the sun would be kinder and where shade would hold its own coolness. She found herbs in the low clump of plants by the back fence, ones she knew how to steep for a poultice, not by virtue of supernatural knowledge, but by the sort of resourcefulness that comes from a life of looking after small things. Her hands moved with the certainty of someone who had lived with brokenness and had learned what mends and what merely covers it. They talked, when they talked at all, in short sentences like those the wind leaves scattered on the plain. Minimal, necessary. He told fragments, enough to show he was not a thief or a liar, nothing to suggest extravagance. He said his name in the first week. It was a small, honest name. He said he had been traveling and that a quarrel had arisen where land met claim, that he had tried to say what was true and had been answered with gunfire. He would stop, ashamed at putting hurt into words he did not want to keep alive. She listened without prying, and her silence became a place to land. Trust in that house grew the way a small plant grows through cracks, unplanned and stubborn. There were mornings when the widow would set a cup of coffee by his hand, and find, when she returned to the kitchen, that he'd used the cup to scoop water for the sore, and returned it to the table with a quiet nod. There were evenings when they sat on the porch with a fire like a low heart in the dark, and the prairie around them hummed in the voice of wind. She would sometimes bring out a jar of her husband's tobacco, not for him to use but because his smell was part history and part comfort, and the man took a single pinch, then pushed it back, as if he understood not only the tobacco, but the manner of reverence it required. Small things signaled deeper shifts. She began to leave the gate unlatched some days. The porch step acquired an extra boot beside her own. The dog's bark, which had once been the measure of any unusual thing, quieted when he approached. He did not speak of gratitude as if it were a coin to be exchanged, but as a currency that could be spent sparingly. One quiet thank you here, a fixed, embarrassed smile there. In the way he moved the kettle or folded a shirt, there was a sort of reverent awkwardness that spoke of humility made physical. Night taught them both different things. For her, there was the return of memory in the hush that settled after chores. A laugh, the echo of a hand closing on another hand, the one-activity silence of two people who did not need words to keep a watch. For him, there was a slow admission that he had been less brave than he thought in the face of others, and braver than he believed when he bent to pick up someone else's burden. He had come into her life with a wound that claimed more than muscle and blood. It had taken his sense of rightness and left him raw. She offered him shelter and, by doing so, the chance to stitch a new sense of self. The question of why he had been shot did not arrive as an accusation but as a small, honest explanation one evening when the sky bleached to a pale gold. They had been sitting beside a small pile of coals, and he turned his face toward her, hands wrapped around a tin mug. The prairie held the light steady, as if listening patiently for what would be said. "It wasn't a mistake," he said, not dramatizing it. "They aimed to scare me off the claim. I spoke up, told what I'd seen, names about who took what when water ran dry. They thought it'd do me good to be quiet. They thought they'd make an example." Her face did not shift. You could read much in the stillness she kept, an inventory of risk and a map of what must be given up to protect a place. She had reasons to keep her door a small world. The town was wide with eyes. A quiet life was not merely preference, it was armor. She turned over what he had said like something in her palm. The prairie hummed at their backs. "You could leave," she said. It was not an order but a proposition, the nearest thing she had to advice. He laughed, small and bitter. "Where would I go that isn't a stretch of dust and someone else's watchful claim?" He looked at the land as if it might answer. "And besides, He stopped, the words failing him. "I told the truth. I can't not tell the truth." She stayed silent, letting the wind smooth the edges of his sentence. Choosing to stay with him, to trust him, was a small revolution in the ledger of her life. She had kept to herself because solitude had been a way to keep the world from taking more. But something in the straight line of the man's honesty pulled at her steadying habit. She remembered the last time she had opened her mouth and been heard by anyone. The cry for her husband when he had been taken. No one had answered then. The words had fallen into the prairie and remained there, and the prairie had kept them. That memory had been both wound and teacher. There was a calculus she had to run, the danger of remaining against the cost of turning him away. She weighed the town's likely gossip, The risk of men resentful of a man who would name names, the possibility that those men might look for retribution. She saw how her life, small, careful, full of the routines that had become almost prayer, might twist into a target. Yet there was also an inward argument that told her the safer choice, if it was only safety for her alone, was a kind of cowardice she could not afford. "I won't send you away," she said finally, not because she sought trouble, but because she recognized the moral measure of loyalty. "If you must go, you'll go knowing I helped. If they come asking, they'll find a house where truth lives." The man took a breath that was half relief and half fear. The prairie, listening, held its long patience like a judge that does not hurry. He left days later with his foot bound and his horse a little uneasy under the saddle, his face set with the particular determination of someone who has been given back enough to feel responsible for it. He said he would return. The morning of his leaving, she made him a small bundle of bread and dried meat, wrapped them in a cloth, and put the photograph from the shelf into his hand. "For the road," she said. He held the photograph as if it were a talisman and tucked it into his coat with a clumsy reverence. "Tell them," he said, as if he were naming the most important thing on his list. "Tell them where you live." "That's not courage," she told him, and she could feel the old iron in him settle, as if meat had been set upon a bone. "That's staying. You could have kept this to yourself and gone on," he insisted. "But you didn't." She only shrugged. "I kept house," she said. "I kept what was needed." He rode off with the sunrise at his back, the prairie opening before him like a long attention. The town was a ribbon of structures and faces, and he rode into it with the sort of caution one puts on like armor, and the sort of truth one can no longer hold silent. What he said in the town square was not a great speech. He spoke plainly, names, facts, the place where he had been fired upon, who had sought to limit the water, and who had tightened their fists to seize more. People listened in small groups, the way people in towns do, with fidgeting attention and the curiosity of those living near the source of a rumor. Some shifted and looked away. Some crossed their arms. For a while, it was uncertain whether anyone would take the word of a wounded man. Then, in the middle of that low hum, the man named the woman who had hidden him. He used her name, his voice quiet but not embarrassed, and said simply that she had given shelter, and that without her the truth would have remained raw and unspoken. There was a small stillness that fell like snow. The townspeople found themselves looking up a road whose end they had never thought to consider as part of their habit. A few went, footfalls making a soft sound on the path. When a handful of them reached her porch, they did not come as a mob, but as neighbors who had been stirred from complacency. They stood in the yard like people who had been given pieces of a larger puzzle and had to fit them together without the relief of an easy solution. Some offered apologies that were more for themselves than for her. Some brought a pie or a jar of preserves, awkward offerings that were always better for being made than not. The man who had been wounded came again with his hat off and something small in his hand, a knife with a carved handle, not a showy piece but solid and useful. He set it down on her table with an honest, shy explanation that it might be of use. Then, in front of a few, he told what had happened and named the widow as the unseen coin in the transaction of truth. Her face, when she listened to the modest parade of thanks and the attention that came like an unexpected weather, held a complicated map. She hadn't wanted this. Recognition made the world louder, and noise unsettled her. She had learned to make peace with the hush. Yet there was something inside that relaxed at the sight of not only the man who had taken up the difficult task of telling, but also the small, modest public acknowledgement that came with his return. It did not erase solitude, nor did it demand her to surrender it. It simply placed a thin light over a part of her life that had been shadows. There were, predictably, dissenters. Not everyone welcomed the spotlight on a place where the social calculus had been to look away when such things arose. There were men who muttered about stirring trouble for the sake of another's pride, but their voices were small compared to the steadying effect of truth articulated, and a few people who decided to stand by it. The conflict that had put the man into the wash did not explode into violence. It shifted inward. Conversations were had behind doors, quiet reckonings occurred over fences, and occasionally a tall figure would be seen crossing the plain to speak privately with those who had opposed him. The exact mechanism of the change did not matter for the widow. What mattered was that the thing that had bitten at her life from outside had moved into the light enough that its edges were visible and could be discussed. She found herself noticed with a gentleness that unsettled her, like being surprised with a small gift. People dropped by not to torment, but to offer small, careful conversation. A woman from town who had once barely nodded on the road now paused to ask about the state of her garden. The pastor, if he could be so called in that small place, brought a basket with bread and didn't speak of faith, but of practical things. The widow received each gesture as if it were a pebble tossed into a quiet pond. Each created a ring in the water that widened but did not change the pond's depth. There was a moment, some weeks after the man had spoken in the square, when a child from town wandered down the path and stood at the low gate, looking at the house as one looks at something unfamiliar and possible. She was the sort of child who knew how to make herself small in a large world. The widow came out and sat on the porch step. The child, after a shy pause, brought forward a bouquet of dried wildflowers she had gathered, yellow and brown, and the color of sun left in the grass. "My mama says thank you," the child announced, straightforward and unashamed. The widow took the bouquet with fingers that had forgotten how to be touched like that. For the first time in a long while, she smiled without the tension of hiding. Despite the recognition, the widow's life did not turn romantic or theatrical. She continued to rise before dawn, to clean the cistern, to breathe dust out of cloths. The changes were small and intimate. She left the gate unlatched on purpose some mornings. She allowed the man who had been wounded to help mend the broken fence. He did not stay in town to bask in any glory. He continued to move through the world with the humility that had always been his. Their relationship slipped naturally into a companionship that was not declared with grand statements, but enacted through the ordinary. Sharing bread, repairing a stove door, the quiet understanding of which tasks could be left undone without catastrophe. She did not seek praise. She only accepted the town's modest recognition as one who had acted when it was needed. There were nights when the widow would walk to the dry wash and stand at the place where she had first found him. The land there wore a certain patience, a soft line of grass and stone that had borne witness to privileged secrets and to cries that had no audience. She would often press a hand to her chest and feel the rhythm there, slow, regular, and watch how the prairie bent to the wind as if it had learned certain stories, and how, in return, it kept them carefully folded. The notion that the prairie had heard her cry and kept it company was not sentimental. It was simple and true. In believing such things, she did not claim the land as kin or summon it into speech. She only acknowledged that the world held what she could not ask another to hold. When the man left again in the late afternoon, there was no grand send-off. He tied his saddle with hands that had learned not only how to ride, but how to be steadier because of the work he'd done while he had recovered. He took with him the photograph that she had first given him on his initial leaving, now worn at the folds where he had touched it. He pressed a small carved token into her palm, a tiny shape of a horse's head, rough and solid. "For the road," he said again, meaning this time that he wanted her to carry a piece of his gratitude in a way that did not ask for change, but for remembrance. "Keep it," she said. The prairie made a sound like a long exhale. He mounted, tipped his hat with that modest, awkward grace he had, and rode away into the sky like a line on a map. The horizon took him and seemed to smooth his silhouette into an old motion of travel. She watched until the dust of his passage dissolved into the ordinary glaze of the air. When she turned, the house was as it always had been, but something inside had eased some tiny weight. Word of what had happened, of the man's bravery, of the widow's quiet give, filtered through the town in the ways such things do, in stalls of a market, over coffee in evenings, in the low solemnness of a few heads bowed. People began, in small measures, to speak her name with a respect that had been earned by an act that required neither flaunting nor self-denial. Yet this respect did not turn her into a public figure or a symbol. It settled like dust. Sometimes it caught in the folds of her sleeves, sometimes it simply passed. She did not change her habits as if reborn. She continued to bury her husband's things with the tenderness of someone who keeps memory from turning brittle. She kept some doors closed because privacy had been her survival, and because the quiet had teaching in it she still needed. But she also, in small ways, allowed herself to be seen. When a neighbor asked if she would come to the church picnic, she declined, not out of pride, but because some things were not hers to join. When someone offered to help repair the cattle pen, she accepted. The difference was that the acts she allowed were chosen, not thrust upon her. There were afternoons when she would sit on the porch and listen to the prairie as if it were telling a story in hushes and sighs. To an outsider, it might sound like empty listening. To her, it was a conversation of a different order. The land had been there to hold the weight of her cries before anyone else would. It had held a grief that was too dense to be moved by ordinary consolation. It had also held a truth so human that when the right person came and named it, the town had to account for it. On the first winter morning after the events that had shifted the town's small moral geography, a man from the square came to her gate carrying a worn ledger. He had not come to demand anything. Instead, he wanted to place a small entry in the town's book, a note that acknowledged what had happened, that named the woman who had intervened, and that recorded, in plain words, that someone had done the decent thing. She signed, not because she craved the record, but because she had learned that words keep things from being erased. She did not write a plea for recompense or a speech of righteousness. She jotted, with a hand steady from years of holding the smallest of tools, her name and the date. The act felt like a small ceiling, a stone set in a simple wall. Time, who keeps all such things even when people move on, did not ask permission. Seasons rolled as they always did. Rain would come, or it would not. Grass would sprout and brown. New faces would pass through the town and learn its histories in new ways. The man who had been wounded rode by sometimes, leaving a trail of dust and the sound of hooves across open land. He sent back news in the form of small, brief visits and the occasional gift of a jar of honey or a small piece of wood he had carved. Their friendship did not require declarations. It was a thing lived at the level of daily acts. Folding a shirt, handing over a mug, stepping into a role not to be lauded but to be necessary. One afternoon, when the sun had that thin, honest light that comes before evening, she walked out beyond the rise where the wash met the plain. She carried nothing but a small bundle, a scrap of cloth and an old coin that had belonged to her husband. She had never had a great desire to turn token into monument. But there are things that need the motion of being set down. At the spot where the man had been first found, she knelt and arranged the cloth and the coin together. And then she walked a few paces, as if to give them room. And for a long time, she did not move. The prairie sounded about her. Wind through dry grass, the distant clack of a branch, the far-off call of a hawk. There was no ceremony here, only the quiet work of being a being in a vast place. She felt something loosen within her, not in a single tearing moment, but as if a small seam had been mended by steady hands. Her cry, what had been a sound of dislocation and brave demand, had been heard by a place beyond the town, and had turned into more than an echo. The prairie had kept it. It had kept it, and returned it to her in the only manner it could, by witnessing that when she had chosen to act, she had mattered. When she returned to the house, the sky was thin, and the porch hummed with the settled, ordinary sounds of evening. The dog slept in a patch of light. A neighbor had left a stew on her stoop. She set things in order with motions she had known a long time. Night came down easy, without theatricality. The wind came back, and the prairie hummed its long, unthreatening song. The man who had spoken truth came again before the leaves had fully fallen, his face lined by rides and time on the road. He sat for a while on the porch step and smoked in silence. Eventually he reached into his pack and pulled out a small knife, the handle carved now with more finesse. He placed it on the table, and then took his hat off and waited. "People remember," he said simply. She glanced at him, the way one looks at someone who has carried something heavy, and returned with its shape softened but still present. "They will," she said. He nodded. "I thought you'd like something that lasts," he added, and the knife's handle was a small testament to that idea. "For the cupboards, for the fields, for the days you don't want to think of us." She felt gratitude that was not loud. It moved like a current under skin. She took the knife and she placed it where the other tools lived, near the stove, a place of usefulness. It fit among them like a new story among old ones. She did not call it a reward. She called it a useful thing. The prairie, that long patient witness, folded their exchange into itself. It did not boast or gossip. It held the story as it held everything else, careful and vast. To say it had spoken was to borrow a human verb for an action that was only like speech. It had listened. It had kept what it heard. That act was enough. People in the town told the story in the way people tell stories, some details smoothed, some emphasized. Children would hear about the brave man who named wrongs, and about the woman who had hidden him. Old men at the feed store would nod and add their low judgments or praise as suits their mood. The widow heard little of this, deliberately. When it reached her, it was in the form of a small loaf left by the next door, or a neighbor's hat tipped on the trail. She accepted these things as if she accepted weather. They came and went, and their presence did not demand she change who she was. Years would pass. The man would sometimes return, sometimes not. That was the nature of a life that moved. Each time he came, he found the house with the same signs of steadfastness. Mended curtains, a jar of tobacco, the photograph, the small tools set in the same order. He found also that the widow's voice, once tightly guarded, had reclaimed a small freedom, not because the world had offered her applause, or because the town had decided to be better, but because she had chosen, in a careful way, to let herself be known in the small measures she deemed fitting. She had traded a little of her armor for the knowledge that someone would stand with truth when she needed it. That knowledge does not hand out salvation. It hands out a fact. A person will be present. In the long after, when the prairie had turned colors and the wind seemed to remember names, children who had been small when the events had happened would come to listen at her gate. They would ask, curious, innocent, what had happened and why she had chosen to help. She would not offer them a sermon. She would simply talk about small things. How water from the cistern tastes sweeter when shared. How a knot that holds means one less worry at night. How a name said aloud can change the shape of a town. There was a certain sternness in that lesson without sermon. You do the small things because they are the honest things to do. You do not act for praise. Nor do you hide so tightly that you cannot ever be known. You keep the prairie with you. Let it hear the things that must be said, and trust that some things, by being true, change the rest. She spoke of courage not as a grand gift, but as a sequence of small choices. The children listened like dry earth listening for rain. Once, very late, after a night when the stars had been bright and the air had the sharpness of honesty, the woman stood at her door and watched the trail of a man who had come and gone many times. He rode slow and unhurried, his silhouette a softened thing against the swelling of ridges. He raised his hand in a small wave that carried a world of meaning. She responded in kind. The prairie was between them, and yet held the memory of every step they'd taken across it. No one heard her cry, except the prairie. The story would be told as either the beginning or the end, depending on who recited it. But the truth of it was neither beginning nor end. It was a place where witness and action met. The prairie had heard, because it had always listened. It remembered because that is its nature. What the widow received was not applause, but a change in the geometry of her days. Her life remained quiet and careful, yes, but it was now threaded with the knowledge that what she offered mattered in a way that did not require fanfare. When winter loosened its hold, and the first green returned to the hillocks, the house felt the small differences of a life gently altered. The photograph on the shelf remained where it had always been, its edges still soft from years of being set down and picked up. The knife rested by the stove, useful and unassuming. The gate was sometimes closed, sometimes left open. The choice belonged to her alone. People would still speak of the incident in the way human beings make sense of the strange and the generous, half story, half myth. But those who had been there, those who had watched an act of care unfurl into a little public reckoning, knew it as a small, bright truth. They understood that courage is not always loud and that a prairie that listens can hold what even a whole town might not. She would sometimes go out to the wash and stand for a long time with the wind making slow stitches through the grass. The land around her did not offer answers in words. It gave instead the steady company that a long listening provides. Her cry had been heard when she could not expect it. It was kept and returned not as a demand but as a witness. In that exchange she found a measure of healing. Quiet, gradual, entirely human. The man rode off once more as seasons turned, leaving dust and the sound of hooves and the faint outline of a life that included her. She watched him go until he was no more than a soft smudge on the rim of the world. Then she closed the gate, swept the porch, and made the tea she had always made. The prairie stood there, the unblinking neighbor to all that had happened. It had kept her secret. It had kept her cry. And, in time, it had returned to her the sense that small acts, held by patient land and steadfast hands, can be a whole kind of justice. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories like this and share it so quiet courage is remembered.